Have you ever heard of the Asriel's Dust meme? You may have seen this gif of Gaster dancing on it, or maybe you just saw an image like this. If so, then you have encountered my handiwork. You see, it was my What is Ralsei theory video that was the inspiration for the Asriel's Dust meme, as a big part of that theory was about how Deltarune's Asriel is secretly dead and his dust was used to create Ralsei. That theory became so infamous that Asriel's Dust has effectively become the flagship theory of my channel, which means that everyone and their grandmother has been begging for a follow-up to this theory now that chapters 3 and 4 of Deltarune have been released. As such, after taking a few months to play the new content, I have come back with a whopper of a sequel to my Asriel's Dust theory. Not only do I think that original theory has held up surprisingly well, but I also now think that the truth is even crazier and more complex than anyone is expecting. I'm talking death, souls, cover-ups, foreshadowing, and a plot that was set in motion all the way back in Undertale. So, strap in and get a snack, as today we will be diving back into the world of Deltarune to find out how Asriel's Dust has become more relevant than ever before. First, we need to talk about the original Asriel's Dust theory, as understanding what I was thinking when I made that theory is important for understanding where my mind has gone since. The primary goal of that video was to explain what the heck Ralsei even was, and it seemed pretty clear at the time that he had some sort of connection to Asriel. His name is an anagram of Asriel, he looks very similar to Asriel, and he even fills many of the same roles that Flowey filled in Undertale, as he explains how to play the game and is aware of the saving and loading mechanic. However, while the connection is obvious, what's less obvious is why I would conclude that Asriel is secretly dead. That conclusion has to do with a couple things, which can most succinctly be summarized as monster funerals, Ralsei's unique powers, and parallels with Undertale. The monster funerals that we learned about in Undertale establish that when monsters die, they turn into dust, and that dust is then put on an object which inherits the essence of that monster. This was how Flowey inherited the memories and personality of Asriel, and given that Deltarune is all about mundane objects being brought to life, it seemed pretty likely that we would encounter a Darkner created from one of these objects imbued with a monster's essence. Furthermore, it seemed likely that such an entity would have powers and abilities that ordinary Darkners do not have, which brings us to Ralsei's unique powers. There's quite a lot to say on this front, but to keep it simple, Ralsei has a great deal of knowledge that no one else has, including about the prophecy and about the saving and loading mechanic. He has the ability to travel between dark worlds without the aid of a lightener, and, most notably of all, he does not turn to stone no matter which dark world he is in. This is quite baffling, as Ralsei seems to actively violate pretty much every rule and limitation that has been established for Darkners thus far, which all but confirms that he is something special. This is made even more likely when you consider the parallels with Undertale. For those who aren't aware, Deltarune has been outright stated to be a parallel story to Undertale, which I have taken to mean that they will have both narrative and thematic parallels to one another. Now, that doesn't mean they are going to follow the exact same plot beats, but it does mean that we will likely see remixes of familiar storylines. Case in point, the Dreamer family. Both games have the Dreamers adopting a human child, both games have the child growing up with Asriel, and both games have Asriel absent from the entire plot, while a suspicious character with clear ties to Asriel takes his place. In case it weren't obvious, Ralsei is a pretty clear parallel to Flowey. Both are neither human nor monster, both have inherited attributes of Asriel, both have far more knowledge of how their world works than anyone else, both introduce themselves before getting blasted blasted with a fireball and both accompany you throughout your journey. There are honestly even more connections than that, but you get the point. And given that we have a parallel to the Dreamer family, a parallel to Flowey, and a notable absence of Asriel, that very much inclines me to think that this story is following a very similar path to the one we saw in Undertale. As such, I have every reason to believe that Asriel is secretly dead, and just like how his dust created Flowey in Undertale, his dust has now created Ralsei in Deltarune. That's already quite a lot to digest, but Asriel's dust theory doesn't end there. You see, while it's true that Asriel died in Undertale, something I glossed over was what happened immediately prior. In Undertale, Kara died first, and their soul was absorbed by Asriel. This transformed Asriel into an entity who was neither human nor monster, a creature simply described as a horrible beast of unfathomable power. As such, if the parallel holds true, then something very similar must have happened in Deltarune, and given that Chris is still alive, that only leaves one possibility. Instead of the human dying and being absorbed by their monster brother, the brother has died and has been absorbed by the human. And this is where the Asriel's dust theory really gets interesting. You see, not only do I think Asriel is secretly dead, that his dust created Ralsei, and that Chris has absorbed his soul, but I also think that all of this was foreshadowed all the way back in Undertale. In that game, we get quite a lot of lore about humans, monsters, and monsters who have absorbed a human soul. That makes sense, as the protagonist was human, the antagonists were monsters, and the main goal of the bad guys was to absorb our soul. However, there is one other type of entity that is only mentioned very, very briefly, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we learn almost nothing about them. I am of course referring to a human who has absorbed a monster soul. This type of entity is mentioned once in passing in Waterfall, and the only thing we learn about them is that such a creature has never existed because the only type of monster with souls that last long enough to be absorbed are boss monsters, and boss monsters are very rare. And that's it. That's all we know about a human who has absorbed a monster's soul. We don't know what powers they would get, we don't know if the boss monster would have some degree of control over the human body, and we don't know how that human would change or evolve as a result of gaining this power. Remember that when Asriel absorbed Kara's soul, he became powerful enough to wipe out an entire village with ease. So presumably a human who absorbs a monster's soul should be altered in an equally radical way. But that's purely hypothetical because we are never given any hard details, and I think that was intentional. I think Toby Fox knew that if he explained this type of entity in too much detail, it would become obvious that we have met such an entity with those exact attributes. I am of course talking about Chris. You see, much like Ralsei, Chris has powers and abilities that no other human or monster has ever demonstrated. The most obvious of these being how Chris can, completely casually, rip out their own soul. They can then toss the soul aside and go off on their own. This may weaken Chris to some extent, but the fact remains that they are somehow able to survive without a soul in their body. That's pretty impressive considering how everything we know about souls says that doing this should be impossible. Back in Undertale, it was established that removing the soul of a living monster would not only require a godlike level of power, but extracting that soul would also kill the monster that it belonged to. This, of course, was foreshadowing how Flowey could only steal the souls of all the monsters in the underground after he had absorbed the 6 human souls. In other words, it took Omega Flowey's near infinite levels of power to steal the souls of monsters. And I'm gonna be real with you, I don't think Chris is packing that kind of heat. Of course, you could argue that Chris can do this because maybe human souls are just easier to remove than monster souls, but I don't think that makes sense. Humans are repeatedly stated to have stronger bodies and stronger souls than monsters, which should make their souls more difficult to steal, not easier. Case in point, there's no explicit moment in either of Asriel's boss fights where he even tries to steal Frisk's soul while they are still alive, implying that it simply wasn't an option. And if not even a god with infinite power could steal Frisk's soul, then it seems somewhat dubious that an ordinary human would be able to do this so casually. Now, to be clear, it is well established that human souls can persist outside the human body, as that is the core crux of Asgore's soul-stealing plan in Undertale. However, there is no evidence that the soul can be removed without killing the human it originally belonged to. That's why Kara had to orchestrate their own death in order to grant Asriel access to their soul. They couldn't simply pop it out of their chest and hand it over the way Chris does. In short, given what we know, neither humans nor monsters should be able to remove their souls without extreme levels of power, and even if they managed it, they definitely shouldn't be able to survive without a soul in their body. That means Chris can't be a normal human. That means Chris must be more than a human. That means Chris must have absorbed a boss monster's soul. But wait, there's even more. You see, in addition to providing a convenient explanation for Chris and Rousse's strange powers while simultaneously paying off a bunch of foreshadowing from Undertale, this theory also answers a question that has been plaguing the Deltarune community for years. Ever since Chris created that dark fountain, we have been asking ourselves, why? Why would Chris, who clearly cares a great deal about their friends and family, risk the destruction of the world? They were there for Rousse's speech. They know that dark fountains can cause an apocalypse. So why are they doing this? What is Chris's motivation for teaming up with the mayor and the Roaring Knight? The answer, I think, is Asriel. The single strongest motivator that anyone can have is love, and Chris undeniably loves their family, especially Asriel. If something happened and Asriel was suddenly killed, then there would be few people more motivated to resurrect him than Chris. They would likely even be willing to work with unsavory characters like the mayor and the knight if it meant bringing their brother back. And given that dark fountains are capable of temporarily resurrecting Lighteners, as we see with the old man, then it makes sense that Chris would believe that this same power has the potential to fully resurrect Asriel. That said, there is a pretty major issue here that lots of people have pointed out. Namely, if Asriel is dead, then why is Chris the only one who knows about it? Even if this theory is true and Asriel really did die, why would Chris keep that fact a secret? Toriel and Asgore clearly think Asriel is away at college, which means Chris would have had to have found a way to trick their parents into thinking that Asriel is still alive, which seems like a lot of unnecessary hassle. Why not simply tell the truth and get assistance in your plan? The townspeople clearly adore Asriel, so you can bet that at least a few of them would be down for helping Chris with this scheme. So, I ask again, why keep up the illusion that Asriel is just away at college? Well, there are two main reasons I can think of for why Chris would do this, with one being thematic while the other is more practical. On a thematic level, I think Deltarune is heavily focused on the idea of obsession with the past and not wanting to let things go. For example, the king's obsession with the past filled his heart with hatred, Spamton wants to return to his glory days as a big shot, Asgore wants to go back to when Toriel loved him, Noelle wants to go back to when her dad and sister were okay, Susie wants the past few days to just repeat indefinitely, and Chris, I think, wants to go back to the days when their family wasn't broken. By By keeping Asriel's death a secret, Chris can maintain their delusional dream of restoring things to how they once were. As for the practical reason for hiding Asriel's fate, I think Chris blames themselves for their brother's death. Whether it really was their fault or not, if Chris believes Asriel died because of something Chris did, then that would heavily discourage them from telling their friends and family the truth. Remember that Chris has spent their whole life living in Asriel's shadow. Asriel was the popular firstborn child of the Dreamer household, while Chris was weird, quiet, and the only human in a town of monsters. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Chris has developed some pretty major insecurities regarding their identity, their place in the hometown, and even their place in the Dreamer family. And because of all that self-doubt, I think Chris has convinced themselves that they can never let anyone know what they did. In Chris's mind, if it ever came to light that they had a hand in Asriel's death, then everyone, including their parents, would hate them forever. This mindset also explains why Chris insists on keeping their activities hidden from their own soul. Why would they do this unless they knew that the soul would object to whatever Chris was planning? If the soul just represented the player, then this wouldn't make sense, as Chris knows nothing about us. But if the soul contains Asriel, then it all clicks into place. Chris knows that Asriel would be completely opposed to them meddling with these dark fountains. Asriel may not be thrilled about being dead, but he has always been a very ethical person. As a result, just like when he refused to let Kara destroy humanity, Asriel would never allow Chris to risk the destruction of the world, even if it meant bringing him back to life. That, I think, is why Chris does their best to keep the soul in the dark. They won't let anyone, not even Asriel, stand in the way of the restoration of their family. And that is more or less the entirety of my original theory. To briefly summarize, Asriel being dead and their soul being absorbed by Chris provides a payoff for Undertale's foreshadowing, an explanation of how Ralsei and Chris came to possess such unique powers, while also providing insight into why Chris would do what they do. Needless to say, I have always been quite fond of this theory, and while it has certainly received some backlash over the years, I've stood by this conclusion through thick and thin. No matter what Toby Fox threw our way, I felt confident that Asriel's dust would stand the test of time, which makes it all the more unfortunate that chapters 3 and 4 have caused some catastrophic issues for Asriel's dust, and those issues have forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about Deltarune. Before we discuss the actual issues that these chapters have raised for my theory, let's first quickly debunk a couple things that people thought would kill my theory, but don't actually impact it at all. First are these piles of dust in the TV world. This may shock those of you who've never watched the original theory and only know about it from the memes, but these dust piles never mattered. They were an afterthought in the original video, and them appearing in the TV world has no impact on my theory whatsoever. Also, even if these piles did matter, the two places that they show up are both heavily associated with Asriel, as one is where Ralsei is found, and the other is the place that Asriel lived. And no, just because his dust appears in two places doesn't mean he died in both places. Goat monsters shed their hair all over the place, and hair turns into dust over time. So these piles being here genuinely means nothing for my theory or the game in general. The second not-so-smoking gun came in Chapter 4 with this line from Ralsei. Now, this scene is notable as it's the first time that the concept of a darkener made from someone's dust has been discussed in any way. However, the idea that it somehow debunks Asriel's dust theory is completely nonsensical. The people citing this as a smoking gun are arguing that it proves Ralsei couldn't be made from Asriel's dust, as these types of darkeners can't appear in other dark worlds, whereas Ralsei has obviously appeared in every dark world. However, not only is it Ralsei saying saying this, who obviously would be happy to lie in order to protect Chris, but also, if you look at his exact wording, it becomes obvious that this line is designed to mislead players. Rousey specifically says, darkners patterned after the memory of a loved one tend to only appear in very specific darknesses. Emphasis on tend. That word alone throws the entire sentiment into doubt, and also makes it pretty clear to me that this line was specifically designed to throw players off the scent regarding Rousey's true nature. And the best part is, this trick 100% worked, as every single person who quoted this line at me has, without fail, misquoted it. That's right, when people reference this line, they always conveniently forget to include the word tend. Now, to be clear, that isn't because people are trying to lie or spread misinformation, quite the opposite. They're saying this because they think it's true, and they think it's true because they have been subtly manipulated into thinking that all darkners made from monster dust can only appear in certain dark worlds, when in reality, that isn't what Rousey is saying at all. Gotta give my kudos to Toby Fox, as he has masterfully misled the community with this line, while also conveniently leaving the door open for my theory to remain true. That's it for all the false smoking guns, which means we can now talk about the stuff that actually causes issues for my theory. The first two notable problems I'd like to discuss are the Roaring Night and December Holiday. Prior to the release of chapters 3 and 4, I was able to integrate these two characters into my theories without stepping on the toes of Asriel's dust, but unfortunately that is no longer the case. At the time, I thought the Roaring Night was a Darkner created from Gerson's dust, and while I was right that such a character existed, I was wrong that they were the Roaring Night. As for December, I largely assumed that she was going to be the Gaster of Deltarune, which is to say that I thought she was going to be nothing more than a mysterious, tragic background character trapped in the code who is largely irrelevant to the main plot. However, after we got more and more focus on Des in chapters 3 and 4, combined with the Roaring Knight's sword briefly looking like this, and it has become pretty clear that December is far more central to Deltarune's main story than I had previously expected. And that's not even touching on the fact that the mayor, who keeps the code to the shelter inside December's guitar, almost certainly is scheming to bring her daughter back to life. Now, I don't know for certain that resurrecting Des is Carol's main motivation, but it does seem extremely likely given everything we know. And with all this drama surrounding the Holiday family, it starts to become increasingly unclear what role Asriel's dust is meant to play in this story. But wait, it gets worse. You see, while the Roaring Night and December Holiday have introduced some pretty tricky complications, none of that compares to the absolute devastation that was unleashed on my Asriel's dust theory by the Snowgrave route. As you are all likely aware, the weird route in chapter 4 has some of the most shocking content we have ever seen in a Toby Fox game. We quite literally see the soul possess Chris, transform their physical appearance, and pursue some sort of terrifying plan involving Noelle. This sequence is then followed by Chris kicking the ever-living hell out of the soul, to the point that their HP is reduced to half by the end of the scene. This is, without hyperbole, the worst thing to ever happen to Asriel's dust theory. Why? Well, for someone like me, who believes that the soul is being controlled by Asriel, this is completely confounding. Why on earth would Asriel have these machinations for Noelle? Why would Asriel's influence cause Chris's hair to turn red? And worst of all, why would Chris viciously attack Asriel after this scene concludes? Remember, Asriel's dust theory relies on the idea that Chris's primary motivation is love for their brother, so them attacking the soul like this just doesn't make makes sense. This scene brings into sharp relief, at least for me, just how antagonistic the relationship is between Chris and the soul. Of course, they've been hinting at this from the start, what with Chris always violently throwing the soul into various cages, but I guess I just didn't appreciate the significance of that until now. The truth is, even if Chris's main motivation is to save a loved one, that loved one cannot be in this soul. Chris simply hates the soul too much for that to make sense. In short, the increased complexity of the Roaring Night conspiracy, the increased significance of December in the narrative, and the clear hatred Chris has for this soul all combine together to convince me that Asriel simply cannot be inside of this red heart. It pains me to say this, but the Asriel's Dust theory, in its original form, cannot function any longer. Rest in peace, Asriel's Dust. You were too beautiful for this world. Wait a second. What's this? The power of the Dark Fountain. It's bringing the theory back to life. Could it be? No, it is. It's Asriel's Dust 2.0. Oh my god. That's right, I'm not giving up that easily. Did you really think I would abandon my beloved Asriel's Dust without a fight? Hell no. We may have taken a licking, but we're gonna keep on ticking. As any good theory crafter would do, I saw the flaws in my theory and I adapted. I went back to the drawing board, looked at all the evidence, and formulated a new version of Asriel's Dust that is bigger, better, and stronger than ever before. This new Asriel's Dust theory not only explains Chris and Rousey, but also explains the Roaring Night, December holiday, and most importantly of all, the true identity of the entity inside of this soul. Without further ado, let's dive in. First off, let's cover everything that I think is still true from the original Asriel's Dust theory. I still think Asriel is dead, I still think his dust created Rousey, I still think Chris blames himself for Asriel's death, and I still think that resurrecting Asriel is Chris's primary motivation for teaming up with the Mayor and the Roaring Night. I sadly no longer think Chris absorbed Asriel's soul, however, I do still think that Chris's soul has been altered by a key event, and that this event is responsible for Chris becoming possessed and acquiring these superhuman powers. And now that we've got the old stuff out of the way, let's talk about the new stuff. Starting with the true identity of the Roaring Night. Now, for those who aren't aware, the most popular theory regarding the Roaring Night is that they are December holiday, mostly because their sword looks like a baseball bat when they initially summon it, and Des is known to be missing. However, right from the get-go, I've never believed that December was the true Roaring Night. After all, just because a theory is popular doesn't mean it's true, as evidenced by the fact that Chris being the Roaring Night was the previous most popular theory. I didn't think Chris was the Roaring Night then, and I don't think Des is the Roaring Night now. No, instead, I have a much juicier idea that parallels Undertale in a far more convincing way. But before I reveal my theory, go ahead and leave a comment down below guessing who you think I'm going to say is the Roaring Night. Or if you want, you could just leave a comment saying who you think the Roaring Night is. Pause the video now if you would like to comment. Got it written down? Okay, cool. Without further ado, I think the Roaring Night is none other than Asriel Dreamer. But wait, I could hear you saying, isn't Asriel supposed to be dead? How can he be the Roaring Night and be Rousey and be dead? The answer, my dear viewers, is that Deltarune is Kingdom Hearts. What do I mean? Well, remember, a monster is made up of two things, a soul and a body. Asriel's body turned into dust and became the Darkner that we know as Ralsei, but his soul went on to become the abomination that we know as the Roaring Night. Now, exactly what process allowed Asriel's soul to endure and also transformed him into this terrifying creature, I don't know. Maybe the power of the Dark World can transform souls. Maybe Asriel's soul was absorbed by a Titan spawn, which would explain why he shares their monochrome appearance. Or maybe Gaster did it, I don't know. Whatever the case, something happened, and the end result was that his soul became the Night, and there's actually quite a lot of evidence to back this up. Firstly are their designs. As far as weapons go, Asriel and the Knight are the only major villains to wield a sword, and when you compare the two, you realize they're actually pretty similar, with both blades having exaggerated features and a large eye or gem in the middle. Both characters also shoot at you with projectiles, which then split into smaller projectiles, and both also utilize an attack where they fly into the center of the screen and suck up a bunch of geometric shapes. Also, take a close look at these two projectiles. They both have this white diamond in the center and are then surrounded by a larger shape. The only difference is that Asriel as a god had these clean outer diamonds, whereas Asriel as the Knight has these harsh, jagged shapes, almost as if the original diamond has been warped and distorted. You could also argue that they have a star-like shape, which would be yet another connection between them, as they both shoot stars. Then there's their physical designs. When you put Asriel's final form next to the Knight, the similarities become clear. Both have gnarly horns, both have ridiculous shoulder pads, both are largely monochrome in color, both have holes on their arms, both have crazy white cores, and both have wide angular hips that then narrow down into thin pointed legs. And then, perhaps most damning of all, is the fact that both designs clearly take heavy inspiration from the Deltarune itself. You may not be able to see it at first glance, but once you swap it out for this distorted version from Chapter 4, it starts to make sense. These jagged wings become their gnarly horns, or arguably even their shoulder pads, the central circle becomes their glowing cores, the middle triangle becomes their wide angular hips and pointed legs, while the two other triangles become the holes in their arms. Given that Asriel was a very religious boy, it makes sense that both versions of him would integrate the main symbol of his religion into their designs. Also, as a smaller note, both entities fight you on a battlefield that keeps changing colors, and both entities are capable of shapeshifting. Beyond their physical appearance, I also want to touch on their behavior. Namely, I want to talk about the core dynamic that defines Asriel in both games. I am of course referring to their relationship with their sibling. In Undertale, Asriel is so distraught at the loss of Kara that he's willing to rewrite reality in order to keep them around. And while the Roaring Knight has yet to speak or show much in the way of emotion, we do get a glimpse at this sibling dynamic. When the Knight overpowers our heroes and downs them all in brutal fashion, they don't do this to Chris. Now, you could argue that this is simply because they're in an alliance, but I would argue that it's hinting at something deeper. This is most plainly demonstrated by the way Chris behaves in the Knight's presence. In their first battle, it's clear that Chris has no desire to fight the Knight, as shown by the fact that their heart gets more and more twisted the longer the fight goes on. That makes perfect sense if the Knight is Asriel, as nothing would be more painful to Chris than being forced to fight the living, breathing personification of their greatest sin. Furthermore, in Chapter 4, Chris gets the opportunity to attack the Knight, but refuses. This is particularly odd given that we know how durable the Knight is. If Chris really wanted to keep their alliance with the Knight a secret, then they should have just made a show of launching an attack that the Knight could easily tank. But they didn't. They just stood there super suspiciously, refusing to do anything. This implies to me that Chris isn't just avoiding conflict with the Knight because they're on the same side, they're avoiding conflict with the Knight because they genuinely cannot bring themselves to hurt their brother. This also explains why Chris makes such a concerted effort to hide the true identity of the Roaring Knight when we try to think about them in Chapter 4. If the Roaring Knight really was December Holiday, then what harm would come to Chris's plan as a result of the soul knowing that fact? We as the player don't know or care about December at this stage of the story, so this revelation really wouldn't have much of an effect, making Chris's choice to hide this fact particularly odd. On the other hand, if the Knight is actually Asriel, then Chris would obviously do anything and everything in their power to bury this secret as deeply as humanly possible. If my theory is correct, then they don't want anyone to even faintly suspect that they caused Asriel to die. So hiding this information, even from the soul, makes perfect sense. And getting back to the Roaring Knight for a moment, while we don't get a ton of personality from them, the way that they laugh in Susie's face and manipulate characters like the King is very reminiscent of Flowey, as he too loved to laugh at his enemies while manipulating the people around him. Then there's the Roaring Knight's theme music. Now, I don't exactly have a good ear for music, but from what I understand, the Black Knife shares a leitmotif most prominently with the door, the chase, and the world revolving. This is very fascinating, as not only are the door and the chase both first used to introduce us to Ralsei's dark world, but perhaps more importantly, you would expect the Knight to be connected to the freedom motif, or the Titan theme, or even the Lost Girl theme, but instead, the only major connections the Black Knife has are with Jevil and Ralsei. Jevil at least makes sense, as he's a secret boss with established connections to the Roaring Knight, but Ralsei seems to come out of left field. I also don't think it's a coincidence that the only main character without an identifiable theme song is Ralsei. Sure, we're given the Castletown theme and the Legend theme, but those are about a dark world and the prophecy, respectively. They aren't specifically focused on Ralsei, and we know this is intentional as every other major character, like Susie, Lancer, Queen, and so on, all have theme music explicitly named after them, but Ralsei does not. Personally, I think this lack of theme music for the Prince is because Ralsei is still figuring out his identity, and when we finally do get his theme song, I suspect it will share a leitmotif with the Roaring Knight. Also, supposedly, there was a song on Toby Fox's old deleted website called Friendship, and this song contained the leitmotif of the Nightmare Knight, but was arranged in such a way that it sounded extremely similar to Asriel's theme from Undertale. Oh, and for those who don't know, the Nightmare Knight is an old song of Toby Fox's that has had some of its leitmotifs repurposed for Deltarune. Now, I can't verify that this Asriel-style Nightmare Knight theme is legit, as, again, I'm not very good at recognizing leitmotifs. But if this is true, then that just adds even more evidence that Asriel is the Roaring Knight. In fact, it would make sense that Toby Fox would delete such a song given how much of a spoiler it seems to have been for Deltarune. And just to add a few sprinkles on the theory crafting pile, I think the reason the Knight turns into a ball is because they really are nothing more than a soul mixed with dark power, which of course results in a sphere that has the white of a monster soul and the black of the dark world. This theory also explains how the Roaring Knight can travel through the light world, as unlike a regular Darkner, they technically have the soul of a Lightner. So even if they're effectively a ghost, they should still be capable of existing in the light world. In fact, given that the Titans are supposedly capable of breaking into the light world, that lends even more credence to the idea idea that the Knight is some sort of Titan spawn combined with Asriel's soul. In addition, by having Asriel be the Roaring Knight, that allows even more parallels with Undertale, as just like in that game, Asriel is once again an unnatural, reincarnated, abominable version of himself who haunts us throughout the game and acts as our primary antagonist. Also, huge shout out to KazooCat for pointing this out, but Chris and the Knight share a comical number of poses. Like, look at all this. Needless to say, having such similar battle poses only further supports the notion that they are in fact siblings. Also, and this is gonna seem like it's coming out of left field, but I wasn't really sure where else to put it in the video, but do you all remember that mysterious character hidden in the code? Specifically, the one that talks about being lost in darkness and begging for help. Originally, we all thought that this was December, as she was the only person that we knew was missing. But now, everyone's jumped on the bandwagon that December is the Knight, which leaves the identity of this code character completely unclear. However, I think I have an idea of who this is, and it might sound like I'm joking, but I sincerely think that this is true. Specifically, I think this code character is also Asriel. You see, unlike with Flowey, I think Asriel's regular consciousness still lives on inside the Knight. However, thanks to the dark power of the Titan spawn, his mind has been utterly submerged in darkness. He can't tell up from down, day from night, or even if he's still alive. This is all described in the new dialogue from the code character. But what really convinces me that this is Asriel is this line here. They reminisce about how much they loved breakfast and late night TV, both of which have since been associated with the Dreamer household. Also, if you look at the original code dialogue, this character is pitifully begging in a way that is extremely reminiscent of the way Asriel behaved when he first woke up as Flowey. Someone like Des seems too tough to immediately resort to begging for help, but Asriel, on the other hand, is repeatedly depicted as being emotionally fragile and prone to crying. Heck, the Knight themselves is seemingly depicted as crying when we first encounter it. This sad little lad with his mind buried inside the darkness of a Titan is the one we are observing when we look into the code. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, let's address a few counter-arguments I can see people making against this theory, starting with the baseball bat. If the Knight really is Asriel, then why would he summon his sword in this shape? Isn't baseball more of a December thing? Well, yes, but also no. You see, it's true that wiffle bats are repeatedly mentioned in association with December. We even see a wiffle bat in her room in Chapter 4. However, there's a detail here that most people overlook. Namely, what do you think a wiffle bat is used for? Well, it's used to play the sport of wiffle ball. And wiffle ball, much like baseball, involves two teams facing off against each other. And given that it's a team game, and we know how popular sports are in the hometown, that would mean December was almost certainly playing this game with other people from around town. And given that she was so close with Asriel that she has one of his shirts in her closet, it would make perfect sense if Asriel was also on her wiffle ball team. Heck, Asriel's room has several shelves dedicated to just his trophies, which are most commonly won from competing in, you guessed it, sports. Which, yeah, that means the most iconic piece of evidence for the December Roaring Knight theory is nothing more than a clever misdirection. Heck, even the horns on the Knight's head, which seem like antlers, are also likely a red herring. Notice how the Roaring Knight's body is heavily distorted, with unnatural sharp protrusions on his legs, hips, shoulders, and torso. This is an entity whose body is a warped, unnatural version of what a normal monster should look like, and that extends to his horns. They aren't aren't multi-pronged because they're antlers, they're multi-pronged because his body is covered in unnatural sharp protrusions, and his horns are no different. Also, it's a helmet and the knight is clearly a shapeshifter, so the antlers really don't prove anything. Then there's the matter of why everyone in the hometown still thinks Asriel is alive, which is actually one of the main pieces of evidence that critics use to argue against Asriel's dust. Specifically, the idea that Chris could cover up Asriel's death all on their own seemed implausible to many fans, but luckily for me, the new chapters have made this much more feasible. Not only does Chris have access to Asriel's computer, which makes impersonating him online quite simple, but Chris is also in an alliance with the freaking mayor, and Carol is cold, methodical, and powerful. If anyone would be able and willing to cover up Asriel's death, it would be her. Throw in the assistance of the Roaring Knight, and Chris has more than enough resources to cover up just about anything, which means one of the biggest critiques of my theory is now thoroughly dead. With all that said, if you don't believe Asriel is the knight at this point, then I don't think anything I say is going to convince you. While I do think my arguments are fairly strong, I suspect the majority of folks will continue to believe that the Roaring Knight is December Holiday. In fact, if I were to end the video right here, I'm willing to bet that the main critique in the comments section would be something along the lines of, "What about Des? If she isn't the Roaring Knight, then what the heck is her deal? How do you, Mr. Crackpot Theory Man, explain the increased focus on December if she isn't the main antagonist?" And to be fair, that is a valid point. If I'm going to kick December out of the role of the Roaring Knight, then it's only right that I provide an explanation for what role she actually fills in this story. And believe it or not, if my theory is true, then December Holiday is even more important than any of you have realized. And if you're a longtime fan of my theories, then you might be able to guess what I'm about to say. You see, not too long ago, I released a video called Chris is Des. It was a pretty clickbait title, as I wasn't actually arguing that Chris was literally Des, but rather that Chris had simply inherited December's role in the narrative. It was a fun little theory, and some elements of it may still be true, but in retrospect, I made a terrible blunder by wasting that title. Because, as it turns out, Chris isn't just metaphorically Des, they are literally Des. Or to be more precise, December is the entity controlling Chris's soul. That's right, baby. It's not called Asriel's Dust 2.0 just because it's a sequel. It's called Asriel's Dust 2.0 because there are literally two boss monster souls in play in this narrative. Not only do I think Des is dead, but I think Chris absorbed her soul, either by being present at the time of her death or by conjuring her soul when they tried to summon a demon. Whichever is true, the end result is the same. Chris has been transformed into a type of entity that we've never seen before. A human who has absorbed a boss monster's soul. And yes, this theory does rely on Des being a boss monster, but why couldn't she be? The Holiday family and the Dreamer family have an awful lot in common. The two families have always been very close with one another. They're both politically very powerful, with Asgore and Carol acting as authority figures. They have opposite elemental affinities, with the Dreamers using fire magic while the Holidays use ice magic. And perhaps most compelling of all is the fact that Rudy is still alive in this timeline, whereas Rudy died in Undertale. Why is that important? Well, it's because boss monsters don't age so long as they don't have children. Once they have kids, their life force is sapped away by those offspring. And if you're a reindeer man with a serious health condition, then having your life force sucked away by not one but two living children would only exacerbate your issues. And in Undertale, where Des and Noelle are confirmed to be alive, alive, Rudy is dead. But in Deltarune, the timeline where December is not alive, Rudy's life force is strong enough to fight off the illness for a little bit longer, hence why he's still kicking. As such, I would say the groundwork for December being a boss monster is pretty freaking strong. But wait, this theory has even more going on. You see, not only does Chris absorbing Dess's soul allow me to continue to politely disagree with player soul theory, but it also explains all the unique attributes that the soul possesses. Why does Susie describe the soul as being good at flirting? Well, it's not because the player is good at flirting, because God knows that isn't true. No, the soul is good at flirting because December was good at it. She was the coolest, most talented, most counterculture girl in the whole stinking town. Of course she'd be good at flirting. As for why the soul is opposed to Chris's plan, again, it's because December is opposed. She doesn't want Chris's harebrained scheme to result in the entire world getting destroyed. This theory also explains why Chris is so harsh towards the soul. It didn't make sense for them to show such hatred towards Asriel, but towards December? That totally adds up. The only times we ever hear about the two of them interacting was when Des would beat Chris up with her bat. In fact, after coming up with this theory, I've reached the conclusion that Chris almost certainly hated December. Why? Well, it's because she was the one who was always hanging out with Asriel. Think about it. She has his sweater in her closet, his retainer next to her weed, and even his terrible ska CD in her collection. They were at least close friends, and possibly dating, which would likely result in Asriel spending less time with Chris and more time with her. And Chris would undoubtedly hate this. Heck, given Chris's insecurities about not being a monster, they may have even projected those feelings of inadequacy onto Asriel and Des, with Asriel's choice to spend more time with a fellow monster hitting particularly close to home. In fact, given how passionate Chris is about playing piano, and given that December was in a band and played a ton of instruments, it may be that Chris became obsessed with learning piano precisely because they wanted to prove themselves to Asriel. It was Chris's way of saying, see, she's not the only one who can play music. I could be in a band too. And remember those weird blog posts from Noelle that talk about Chris suddenly freezing and then going off to play piano? Well, I think that is tied up with December as well. I think when Chris was hanging out with Noelle, Asriel was upstairs hanging out with Des. I think these moments where they suddenly freeze were moments where they remembered Asriel's budding relationship with December, which prompted Chris to feel jealous and head off into the other room in order to practice piano and win Asriel back. Heck, we know that at one point Chris brought bratty food in exchange for being allowed to hang out with her, and I reckon this was Chris trying to prove that they were cool enough to hang out with the older kids like Des and Asriel. As you can see, once you have this context of Chris trying to fight Des for Asriel's attention, a whole lot of Chris's character starts to click into place. And if Chris had this sort of tense rivalry with Des when she was alive, then it makes perfect sense that Chris would have such a harsh attitude towards her now that she is literally inside of their soul. Des may very well have been Chris's least favorite person, so being possessed by her is probably a worst case scenario. In fact, given the dynamic between Des, Asriel, and Chris, and given that my theory holds that Chris was somehow involved in both of their deaths, I think a picture of what happened is starting to come together. Now, I won't paint an exact picture myself, as coming up with a dramatic, detailed story is precisely what caused people to dismiss my original theory. However, I will say this. There is a lot of evidence that Chris was involved with a murder, that Chris has been inside the shelter, and that December vanished under mysterious circumstances. As such, I wouldn't be surprised if Chris not only had a hand in December's death, but also took actions that accidentally resulted in in Asriel's death. Maybe the demon summoning was meant to bring back Asriel, but since he had already become the knight, Chris ended up summoning December's soul instead. Maybe then Chris absorbed her soul, possibly mistaking her for Asriel, only to immensely regret that decision. In fact, maybe it was Des who forced Chris to reveal her fate to Carol, which was how this unlikely alliance between Carol, Chris, and the knight came to be. This also explains why the mayor says the word "you" in bright red capital letters in this scene. It's clear that she's talking to the soul, but now we understand why. She is talking to her daughter. This is Carol telling December that no matter what form she takes, she is always welcome in their home. This theory may even explain why Carol in particular calls Chris at the end of the Snowgrave route. She simply noticed Noelle's increased interest in Chris and is now concerned by what this could mean for December. With all that said, I don't think Des is aware of what happened to Asriel, or at the very least, she isn't aware that he has become the Roaring Knight. That is why Chris has worked so hard to hide the Roaring Knight's identity from the soul. Des was quite possibly in love with Asriel, so if she found out that Chris had a hand in his death, then not only could she bring physical harm to Chris's body, but she would be even more determined to put a stop to Chris's schemes. Speaking of determination, given that I theorized that December was the original controller of the timeline in my Chris is Des video, I reckon it is quite feasible that Chris specifically inherited their ability to save and load from December, which is why their save points are gray instead of yellow. With all that said, there is still a rather large elephant in the room that I've yet to discuss. I am of course talking about the weird route. It's one thing to say that Des is trying to stop Chris in the normal route, but it's a whole other thing to say that Des is responsible for tormenting Noelle in the weird route. So, how do I explain December's behavior in this sequence? Well, there's two primary reasons that I can think of for December acting in this way. The first is the player. While the soul is not a simple representation of the player, our influence is still integral to this story, just like it was in Undertale. In that game, we are controlling Frisk directly, and thus whether Frisk is a mass murderer or the savior of the underground is entirely up to us. We can corrupt their character if we so choose, and the same is true with December. Remember, we aren't controlling Chris directly the way we did with Frisk. We are controlling the entity inside of their soul. In other words, we are controlling December. So while we can still supply a corrupting influence, we can only exert that influence upon December herself, which is why Chris can rebel against us. However, and this is important, while we can corrupt December, we cannot change the reality of who she was up until now. Which brings us to the second reason for the weird route: December's character. You see, we may have turned December to the dark side, but all that does is force us to explore the darkness within her own psyche. This route is all about Noelle because that's what December wants it to be about. And while it may seem like our actions are too harsh or too cruel for Des to inflict on her sister, just remember that our main goal throughout the weird route is to make Noelle stronger. And while we end up pursuing that goal through some extremely dubious methods, you could absolutely view this as an expression of tough love. Keep in mind that December is Carol's daughter, and Carol is all about expressing love through the most cold and controlling methods available to her. And this concept is really hammered home when you look at the symbolism of the thorn ring. This ring makes Noelle stronger and lets her do things she never thought she could do, but at the cost of her own will being supplanted by December's. The use of a ring of thorns, which are the harsh and painful side of a rose, is a direct metaphor for the painful side of love. When December forces this ring onto Noelle, it's like she's saying, I'm hurting you because I love you, and this is for your own good. If the weird route was really about the player, then it wouldn't make sense for us to hyper-focus on Noelle. But if my theory is true, and the weird route is actually about December, then it makes perfect sense for her to focus on her sister. Us choosing to pursue the Snowgrave route instead of the normal route is effectively us choosing to allow December to enact her will, just like how the No Mercy route in Undertale allowed Kara to enact their will. Heck, something I only found out about just recently thanks to KazooCat was how, during the Snowgrave route of Chapter 2, the song that plays right before we fight Birdly has some striking similarities to Raise Up Your Bat, which, for those who aren't aware, is a song that was likely written by December. This connection is made even more likely when you realize that the Snowgrave song in question is literally titled D, which is almost certainly referencing December. Toby Fox is explicitly tying December to the most climactic moment of the Snowgrave route, and he is doing this because this moment was specifically orchestrated by December herself. Now, you may be wondering what December's end goal is in the weird route, and how that ties in to the prophecy. Well, the good news is I do have an answer for those questions, and I think you're gonna find my conclusions very interesting. However, the bad news is this video has already gotten over an hour long, so for the sake of brevity, I'm going to save my Snowgrave theory for another day. To summarize the conclusions of Asriel's Dust 2.0, Asriel and December are both dead, and Chris blames themselves for this event. Asriel's soul went on to become the Roaring Knight, while Asriel's dust went on to become Rousey. December's soul was absorbed by Chris, which transformed them into an entity with unique powers, including the ability to remove their soul and the ability to seal dark fountains. Des and Chris have an antagonistic relationship, both due to them vying for Asriel's attention in life and due to them opposing each other's plans now that they've been combined into one entity. Chris's goal is to resurrect Asriel, Carol's goal is to resurrect December, and December's goal is to protect her sister and the world in general from Chris. Des is not the Roaring Knight, Asriel is not alive, Chris is not the victim here, and the soul is not a representation of the player. And with all that controversial theory crafting finally complete, I think we can draw this video to a close. A huge shout out to all my loyal patrons for their incredibly generous support. A special thanks goes to E-Roll, Ash the Fox, Limping Penguin, Tibby Fitzhugh, and Spampton PFP for supporting me on the Noelle tier. An extra special thanks goes to Sans the Reaper and SMS for supporting me on the Rousey tier. And a huge thanks has to go to Spindrift and Lex.Ham for being the only big shots willing and able to support me on the Spampton tier. YouTube hasn't been paying very well lately, so without y'all's generosity, I wouldn't have been able to pay my bills. So thank you all very, very much. And with all that said, I think it's time for us to say goodbye. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you have something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.